A few years ago, my daughter moved to Denver, and she tells me now that she will never leave. And though I'm much more of a tropical kind of guy, I like the islands, I get it, because you can't go out to Denver any time of the year, almost anywhere in Denver. If you get just a little bit of elevation, you look up and you see the Rocky Mountains in the distance, and you can't not want to go be in it. It just has a gravitational pull that makes you want to go. And actually getting into it is the only way that you can really enjoy the mountains. You have to go stand on one of them to look at the others. Our members Dick and Marty Lund own and are presently visiting the home where Dick grew up in Manitou Springs. And Manitou Springs, if you ever get to go out and visit Dick and Marty, that's where a little tram goes from the bottom of the mountain up to Pikes Peak, the highest peak in the Rocky Mountains. And high up in that thin, dry air, you can look around and see just the most amazing view of all the mountains there in the Central Rockies. I use that image with my students when I teach a course on world religions because I believe it's nearly impossible to talk about world religions from any kind of an objective point of view, that you like viewing a mountain range where you have to stand on one mountain to view the others. I think understanding religions means that you really kind of have to be a part of one of them to view the rest of them. Now, these days, I consider myself to be more of a Unitarian than anything else, but there's no way around the fact that I grew up as a Protestant Christian. I went to college, I went to seminary as a Protestant. Though I did my doctoral studies in Catholic monasticism, even then, I was a Protestant Christian. And in the 1990s, I published what I thought was a very important book about Catholic monasticism. And when I look back at it now, across 20, 25 years, I realize that it was a very Protestant book about Catholic monasticism. So now, when some of the textbooks I use, you'll read where a Buddhist or a Hindu or an Islamic or Jewish scholar is writing about Christianity, I realize that they're not very accurately describing the Christianity that I know. And it's not that they're wrong, it's that they are talking about my faith from their faith perspective. And so when you view one mountain from another mountain, it never looks just like the mountain does when you're standing on it. This becomes very clear to me that even though I try to speak of other religions in very respectful intonations when I'm talking to my students, and these other scholars write in very respectful ways, they're not saying exactly how I feel about those things. The most recent textbook that we were using at Drury about world religions, what it said about Christianity, I didn't believe anything that it used as the basic tenets of the Christian religion. So all I'm saying is that it behooves us all to be polite about this at the very least, to try to be gracious when we're dealing with other people's faith. Every religion in the world is like a language of an ancient culture that was trying to articulate its most closely held beliefs. You can trace the evolution of those languages as they change to suit different centuries and different cultural needs. I think it's fair to describe Judaism as having been at least 3 distinctly different religions, the earliest being a Semitic tribal religion that was based on animal sacrifice in an ancient temple. And the most recent iteration of Judaism is a religion based on religious text that is in scattered synagogue services. The ancient one had a priesthood. The current one has rabbinic teachers. It has evolved into many expressions of various practices and observances. But a Jew or a Semitic religious person from 1500 BC would not recognize the Judaism of 500 BC, who would not recognize the Judaism of 500 AD. There are also many ways of being Buddhist, and there are obviously many ways of being Christian. It would be absurd to say that one is right and all the others are wrong, just like it would be crazy to say that among the world's languages, if you look at Chinese, English, German, or Quechua, that one of them is right and the others are all wrong. Each is wedded to a place and a culture, and each one also changes as the needs of its adherents and practitioners change. The denominational church that fired me many years ago did so largely because of my lengthy advocacy for gay rights. But today, they have an openly gay married pastor. No religion is static. They were able to change, and I will credit myself to a certain degree of having put my own flesh in the meat grinder to help them get to a point where they would hire an openly gay pastor, because we are all evolving. A lot of my attraction to identify with Unitarian Universalists is that they are at least striving to provide an umbrella under which people of various faiths can stand together, that especially in communities like Springfield, where you may, if you come from another country and you are a Zoroastrian, or if you are an adherent to a fairly minor voice in religion, the Unitarians might be the place where you could at least gather with people who accept who you are and are open to you. I recognize that even though most of the time when I get invited to speak somewhere, I'm being invited to a Unitarian church, and I'll tell you quite frankly, I get standing ovations in Unitarian churches from time to time, and when I have had occasion to speak in a Baptist or a Presbyterian church, usually there's a few people that walk out before I'm done. So, you know, you could view that as a bit of a litmus test of theologically both where I am and where they are. But I recognize that even as I attempt to take a much broader view of an interfaith or an open-minded progressive view of faith in general, that I'm still 90% progressive Christian. That's just who I've been, that's where I grew up, that's what I studied, that's what I know. I can no longer bear the exclusivity of a lot of the religious claims of Christianity, and I cannot stand the supernatural theistic aspects of a lot of the expressions of Christianity. Even people that want to be progressive Christians will oftentimes just fall right back into the language of supernatural theism. I got a little short-tempered with one of our listeners who likes to send me stuff by Richard Rohr all the time. And it's like, sure, if you are a conservative Roman Catholic, Richard Rohr might be a breath of fresh air. But when you read what he still writes like God was an old man who lived on a throne in the clouds, who sent his son to accomplish a particular theological purpose, which may be kinder and gentler than what traditional Roman Catholicism or evangelical Christianity says. But the language still contains the seeds of a denial of reality that is what has given us homophobic, anti-women, misogynist, and exclusive claims for Christianity that allows people to do things like the Muslim ban, which I don't know, in the midst of all of the impeachment and the Super Bowl and everything, we've expanded the Muslim ban to 5 more nations just this week. That this kind of prejudice is rooted in the assumptions and the language that even progressive Christians are using. So I don't know if Richard Rohr listens to my stuff, but Richard, if you're listening, grow up. Still, while I advocate for respectful interfaith perspective that does not insist that one mountain in a mountain range is better than another, or one language is right while the others are wrong, and no one religion is superior to another, I would not have you mistakenly come to the conclusion that I'm embracing some kind of theological relativism. I am not. Faiths are not divided simply between Christians, Jews, pagans, Buddhists, Muslims, and Hindus. Every faith, every denomination, every congregation is also divided between good aspects and bad ones. A lot of people leave traditional religions in order to be liberated to, they might choose to be pagan or Wiccan, or they tell themselves they're Druid. But some of the most toxic, narcissistic people I've ever met were involved in those faith expressions, that everything that was wrong with Christianity, they took with them into a new spiritual universe. That if you're going to pack up and move from one mountain to another, you should leave all the poisonous stuff behind, right? Don't take it with you and set up camp in another place. I'm going to give you some concrete examples, as if I were a Supreme Court justice, just telling you where everybody else is wrong. But I'm going to, well, you're used to it, so here we go. When I was a pastor on the east side of Louisville, we had a ministerial alliance for our part of Louisville, Jeffersontown area of Louisville. And every year we hosted a Thanksgiving service that moved from one church to another in turn, that hosted the community event. And then we rotated pastors so that the oldest, newest pastor, the person that had not spoken most recently, would be the speaker. Well, one year, it was the turn of the African American Baptist Church to be the host, but it was the turn of the female Methodist pastor to be the speaker. And so in our planning meeting, the Baptist pastor very apologetically said that they did not allow women to speak in their church. That was a long meeting. I had a lot to say. That was not them, by the way. That's just a generic Baptist conference. But what I said was that it was time for them to change their policies. That a generation earlier, you might have had a white church in Louisville, Kentucky that wouldn't have allowed a black speaker. And if the civil rights movement was only about race prejudice, but not about gender prejudice, then the civil rights movement had a real hypocritical hole right in the middle of it. That if we are going to be willing to declare one kind of prejudice to be absolutely wrong so that we can be more liberating in approach to race, then people who have been victimized by racial prejudice don't need to try to perpetuate prejudice based on gender. Or, more emphatically, they wouldn't have even considered this conversation, sexual orientation. Amen. But they refused to let her preach, and so I refused to participate in the service because, men and women, being tolerant of other people's religious views does not mean that you tolerate intolerance. Does that make sense? That you have to have a moral boundary line. And yeah, I am aware, as he said at length, that Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 34, that women should not be allowed to speak in church. But folks, that's just one of the things that Paul was wrong about. That's just one. There are larger issues. And what even progressives have had difficulty doing sometimes is to look at the Bible and say, that is wrong. To look at Paul most of the time and say, you are wrong. Say it with me, would you? You are wrong. It takes a lot of courage to get to a point for people that grew up on the mountain where you were memorizing Scripture and being fed Scripture to be able to say, just because it's inside that leather-bound book doesn't mean that it's right. The fact that that entire book was written by people that didn't know where the sun goes at night should give us a certain level of suspicion about how accurate they could be about certain sociological things and certainly scientific things. We keep our ancient religious texts because they are a part of our history. That part's good. But folks, just because something is old doesn't mean that it's superior to something that's new. One of the biggest mistakes I made as a pastor in a denominational church was that I kept asking permission to be allowed to do the right thing. For 15 years, I kept asking the board of my last church if I could conduct same-sex marriage ceremonies in the church. And they kept saying no. And I thought, well, I don't own the building, and I work for them. And so I did same-sex weddings and bed and breakfasts in Eureka Springs. I kept getting closer to the church. I started 100 miles away, and then Chinese restaurants just south of town, and then in people's backyards. And after 15 years of being told no, I asked again, and the board voted, and they voted against a couple that were very active in the church, that contributed to the church, that participated in the church. And one of the board members, love this guy. He raised his hand after the end of the vote, and he said, now, just to be clear, when a gay person puts a check in our offering plate, do we cash that or do we give that back to them? Because it's about the money, isn't it? So I decided in that moment that I was no longer going to ask permission to do the right thing. I was just going to do it. So in 2007, I did those two ladies' wedding, and that set the stage for us to start this church in 2008. As my daughter would say, sorry, not sorry. And yes, in spite of the homiletical gymnastics that many more liberal churches go through, to insist that the Bible doesn't really condemn homosexuality, and sure, the English word homosexual didn't even exist until the early 20th century, the truth is that there are some passages of the Bible, not many, but there are some that condemn sex between two men. Lesbians have always kind of flown under the radar. Somehow that never bothered ancient religious writers, but gay men, that was always a problem. And much the same can be said of Islamic teachings, and though there are open and affirming Hindus, Muslims, and Buddhists, there are also those that remain very closed-minded and still promote prejudice. Again, tolerance of differences in religious belief does not include tolerance of intolerance. If we don't push back against prejudice, those other faith traditions will not evolve, and it is unfair to them. We are not doing them a favor if we act like their intolerance is acceptable because it's part of their religion. When I first started teaching at Drury, I had a student who had failed one of the core curriculum classes at the time, Life and Teachings of Jesus. He had failed it 4 times, and he could not graduate until he passed that class. And so he was a student in my class. He almost never showed up. When he did, he got there late. He never turned in his assignments. And I went to the chair of the department, and I said, I don't see how I can give this guy a passing grade when he's not even trying to do the work. And yet, he's 24 years old and trying to graduate from college, and this class is the only thing standing in his way. And the chairman, who was a jerk about a lot of things, but in this particular case, I thought he was insightful. He said, you have no right to cheat him out of what he has earned. And so if he has earned an F, who are you to not give him what he's earned? That was 20-some years ago. He may still be a student at Drury. I don't know, but he got an F from me. Prejudice is wrong. It really doesn't matter what it says in the Torah, in the Quran, or even in early Buddhist texts. And Buddhists can be so much more open-minded, whereas we always tend to think that gender is either male or female. They always had 4 genders. They always understood that it's not just a binary choice. But even still, even within ancient practices of Buddhism, there was prejudice. And we've got to be able to say that that is wrong. Now, folks, the mere fact that many religious traditions are quite ancient doesn't mean that they are superior to modern thought or that they should carry authority. Who here today would willingly go to a dentist who only practiced 17th century dentistry? Now, I realize that many people love the security they feel in insisting that the Bible is the Word of God or the Quran was given to the prophet by God, or who try to find security in believing something that is clearly not true. But folks, older doesn't equate to good, and sometimes older specifically is bad. One of the more troubling aspects of religious hypocrisy is when it comes to trying to legislate our religious beliefs so that we impose our beliefs on the whole of society rather than simply imposing it on our own lives. As Archibald McLeish wrote, religion is at its best when it asks us to ask hard questions of ourselves. It's at its worst when it deludes us into thinking that we've got the answers for everyone else. If you don't believe in abortion, don't have one. If you don't believe in divorce, don't get one. If you don't believe in same-sex marriage, don't marry someone of the same gender. Problem solved, right? If you don't believe in birth control, buy a minivan and a really big house and bunk beds, I guess. The problem with this simple mantra is that it falls apart upon application. I think that ethics, justice, demands that women be allowed to manage their own reproductive lives. Surely that didn't surprise anybody here. I think that everyone should be able to marry the person that they love. And I want that in legislation. So I'm kind of breaking Archibald McLeish's rule there. I think that it is wrong for certain religious values to end up in legislation, but I've got religious values that I want to end up in legislation. Now I can say that I am, but I'm right, and that does make a difference. You could say that ipso facto, my position is offering greater freedom, greater rights, greater democracy. And that could become your dividing line if you're saying, as a spiritual person, I'm advocating for more rights. But folks, let's be honest, even that isn't always true. I have asked you to join me in protests in front of fast food restaurants asking for an increase in the minimum wage. So in that case, I'm not interested in freedom of business owners. I'm interested in legislating morality. We have marched in front of payday loan businesses because I think payday loan interest rates should be capped at 36 or 39%. I think anything past that becomes absolutely abusive. But I am wanting to legislate a restriction of freedom, both on the lender and the borrower, of just how crazy their loans can be. We have gone to our senators' offices to demand prison reform. We have marched on our congressman's office protesting child separation policies. We have demonstrated against illegal wars. We have demonstrated in favor of universal health care. Frankly, folks, we have been more active in legislation than the United States Senate. Our religion, our spirituality demands that we not stand idly by, that we get involved, because our spiritual community exists within a culture. While a part of me is sincerely very sympathetic with Archibald McLeish in saying that the better part of religion inspires me to question my own motives, my own morals, but I can't give up the fact that there are spiritual insights that need to be heard in the marketplace that we need for our society to hear us. I would be mad as a wet hen if local Jews and Muslims tried to outlaw bacon. Or if local Buddhists and Hindus tried to outlaw all meat. But I could get behind a movement to outlaw corn syrup as a food additive. And you know, as a clergyman who has watched a lot of people die through the years and watched a lot of people with terminal illnesses, not legalizing marijuana is one of the dumbest things our government has ever done. Marijuana is a useful drug. There are problems with it. Folks, there's problems with aspirin. But it is wrong for our federal government to decide that people cannot use a natural drug to benefit them in the face of any number of illnesses, including anxiety disorders, which I appear to cause in very many of you. Some of you, some of you would get more out of church if you could just kind of take the edge off before you came. I'm just saying. Our spiritual communities exist within a society. And while there are Mormon spinoffs that still declare that their religious value promotes polygamy, I can't help but believe that polygamous relationships wind up being abusive to women in almost every case. You can point at some cases where it's not, perhaps, and there are polyamorous families right here in Springfield. David Ketchum knows some, and he keeps telling me that they have a very healthy relationship with each other. I will tell you, this is one of the places where David and I don't always agree. I am suspicious of polygamous relationships because it's almost always the women that get taken advantage of. There are very many Muslim women, some that I know personally, who choose to wear a headscarf to cover their hair and sometimes their faces in public. But I cannot accept that any community of faith could impose that on the women in their community. You don't see any men walking around wearing headscarves. There comes a point where no matter what your religious convictions are, that you have to value individual choice, freedom, liberation, and a rejection of homophobia and misogyny and xenophobia. Now, you already know this, but I want to say it very plainly now. It really doesn't matter to me if you're religious or an atheist. It doesn't matter if you're a Buddhist, a Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, or Christian. But there is a healthy way to be any one of those things, and there are unhealthy ways to be any one of those things. Do you see what I'm saying? Say amen. I feel lonely sometimes. Healthy spirituality teaches radical compassion. It advocates for equal human rights for all. It promotes peace among individuals and among nations. It affirms the search for greater knowledge and insight through scientific research, and it defends the health of the planet and the well-being of all of its inhabitants. And if you can get to that place, then, you know, the songs you sing or the creeds you recite or the way you practice your faith, that's none of my business. It becomes my business when you try to divide people through judgment or perpetuate discrimination of any sort. We know about Christians and Jews and Muslims who actually advocate for military violence as well as for harsh punishment within and among their own people. We are exhaustingly familiar with religion that denies science and is either indifferent towards or even exploitative of the environment and the earth's inhabitants. In my experience, the unhealthy expressions of religion outnumber the healthy expressions of religion. And I'm not happy saying that. We're obviously a very small church here. The people that listen to my videos are the rank minority of religious people in the world. But it is sad to me to say that in 2020, after multiple generations of what should have been sufficient scientific education for people to be more aware, that there's a lot more unhealthy religion than there is healthy religion. Therefore, I declare it is time for a reformation that sweeps across Islam, Christianity, Judaism, every world religion, including a great deal of Hinduism and Buddhism. And I don't say that as a threat to their continued existence. All I'm saying is that it's time for all of us to focus on getting healthy. Now, maybe that's just my opinion, but you know, I also happen to be right.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.